The Algonquins are indigenous inhabitants of North America who speak the Algonquin language, a divergent dialect of the Ojibwe language, which is part of the Algonquin language family. Culturally and linguistically, they are closely related to the Odawa and Ojibwe, with whom they form the larger Anicinàpe grouping. The Algonquin people call themselves Omàmiwinini of the more generalized name of Anicinàpe. Though known by several names in the past, the most common term Algonquin has been suggested to derive from the Maliseet word elakómkwik. They are our relatives, allies. The much larger heterogeneous group of Algonquin-speaking peoples who, according to Brian Conwell, stretch from Virginia to the Rocky Mountains and north to Hudson Bay, was named after the tribe. Most Algonquins live in Quebec. The 9 Algonquin bands in that province and 1 in Ontario have a combined population of about 11,000. Many Algonquins still speak the Algonquin language, called generally Anicinàpe and specifically Omàmiwinini. The language is considered one of several divergent dialects of the Anishinaabe languages. Among younger speakers, the Algonquin language has experienced strong word borrowings from the Cree language. Traditionally, the Algonquins lived in either a birch bark wigwams or in wooden mekiwams. Today, Algonquins live in housings like those of the general public. Traditionally, the Algonquins were practitioners of Midwewan. They believed they were surrounded by many Manitoka spirits in the natural world. French missionaries converted many Algonquins to Catholicism in the 17th and 18th centuries. Today, many of the people practice traditional Midwewan or a syncretic merging of Christianity and Midwewan. In the earliest oral history, the Algonquins say they migrated from the Atlantic coast. Together with other Anicinàpe, they arrived at the first stopping place near Montreal, while the other Anicinàpe peoples continued their journey up the St. Lawrence River. The Algonquins settled along the Anicinàpe, a long important highway for commerce, cultural exchange and transportation. Algonquin identity, though, was not fully realized until after the dividing of the Anicinàpe at the third stopping place. Scholars have used the oral histories, archaeology, and linguistics to estimate this took place about 2,000 years ago, near present-day Detroit. After contact with the Europeans, especially French and Dutch, the Algonquin nations became active in the fur trade. This led them to fight against the powerful Iroquois, whose confederacy was based in present-day New York. In 1570, the Algonquins formed an alliance with the Montagnais to the east, whose territory extended to the ocean. French contact. The Algonquin first met Europeans when Samuel de Champlain came upon a party led by the Kichisi-Pirini chief Tessouat at Tadoussac, in eastern present-day Quebec, in the summer of 1603. They were celebrating a recent victory over the Iroquois, with the allied Montagnais and Iroquois. Champlain did not understand that the Algonquins were socially united by a strong totem clan system rather than the European-styled political concept of nationhood. The several Algonquin bands each had its own chief. Within each band, the chief depended on political approval from each of the band's clan leaders. Champlain needed to cultivate relationships with numerous chiefs and clan leaders. From 1603, some of the Algonquin allied with the French under Champlain. This alliance proved useful to the Algonquin, who previously had little to no access to European firearms. Champlain made his first exploration of the Ottawa River during May 1613 and reached the fortified Kichisi-Pirini village at Morrison Island. Unlike the other Algonquin communities, the Kichisi-Piriniwak did not change location with the seasons. They had chosen a strategic point astride the trade route between the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. They prospered through the collection of beaver pelts from native traders passing through the territory. They also were proud of the cornfields. At first, the French used the term Algonquin only for a second group, the Wavatskechiriniwak. However, by 1615, they applied the name to all of the Algonquin bands living along the Ottawa River. Because of keen interest by tribes to gain control of the lower Ottawa River, the Kichisi-Piriniwak and the Wavatskechiriniwak came under fierce opposition. These two large groups allied together under the leadership of Sachem Charles Parcherini to maintain the Omàmiwinini identity and territory. French-Indian War, 7 Years' War. See main articles. French and Indian War, 7 Years' War. The Iroquois Confederacy drove the Algonquins from the lands. They were aided by having been traded arms by the Dutch, and later by the English. The Iroquois and the English defeated the French and Algonquins. In 1623, after Sir David Kirke's occupation of New France demonstrated French colonial vulnerability, the French began to trade muskets to the Algonquins and their allies. French Jesuits began to seek Algonquin conversions to Roman Catholicism. Through all of these years, the Iroquois never attacked the Kichisi-Piriniwak fortress, but, in 1642, they made a surprise winter raid, attacking the Algonquin while most of the warriors were absent, and causing severe casualties. On March 6, 1647, a large Mohawk war party attacked the Kichisi-Piriniwak living near Trois-Rivières and almost exterminated them. The Kichisi-Piriniwak were still at Morrison Island in 1650 and inspired respect with the 400 warriors. When the French retreated from the Huron country that year, Tesuit is reported to have had the superior of the Jesuit mission suspended by his armpits because he refused to offer him the customary presents for being allowed to travel through Algonquin territory. Some joined the mission at Sillery, where they were mostly destroyed by an infectious disease epidemic by 1676. Encouraged by the French, others remained at Trois-Rivières. The settlement at nearby Point du Lac continued until about 1830. That year, the last 14 families, numbering about 50, moved to Kanesatake-Niroka. The Sulpician Mission of the Mountain was founded at Montreal in 1677, and some Algonquins settled there together with Iroquois converts. The mostly Mohawk community became known as Kanawake. But many Algonquin maintained their attachment to the traditional territory and fur trading. Those who agreed to move to established reserves or joined other historical bands were federally recognized. Many others who did not relocate were later called stragglers in the Ottawa and Pontiac counties. Settlement in Quebec. Starting in 1721, many Christian Algonquins began to settle for the summer at Kanesatake-Niroka. The Mohawk Nation was then considered one of the 7 nations of Canada. Algonquin warriors continued to fight in alliance with France until the British conquest of Quebec in 1760 during the 7 Years' War. After the British took over colonial rule of Canada, their officials sought to make allies of the First Nations. Fighting on behalf of the British Crown, the Algonquins took part in the Barre-Saint-Leger campaign during the American Revolutionary War. Loyalist settlers began encroaching on Algonquin lands shortly after the Revolution. Later in the 19th century, the lumber industry began to move up the Ottawa Valley, and a lot of Algonquins were relegated to a string of small reserves. Economy. Although the historical Algonquin society was largely hunting and fishing based, some Algonquin practiced agriculture and cultivated corn, beans, and squash, the famous Three Sisters of Indigenous horticulture. Being primarily a hunting nation, the people emphasized mobility. They used materials that were light and easy to transport. Canoes were made of birch bark, sewed with spruce roots and rendered waterproof by the application of heated spruce resin and bear grease. During winter, toboggans were used to transport material, and people used snowshoes to get around. The women used tiki nagan to carry the babies. It was built with wood and covered with an envelope made of leather material. The baby was standing up with his feet resting on a small board. The mother would then put the tiki nagan on her back. This allowed the infant to look around and observe his surroundings. The child was kept close to the mother but also had much stimulation. Algonquin-speaking people also practiced agriculture, particularly south of the Great Lakes, where the climate allows for a longer growing season. Notable indigenous crops historically farmed by Algonquins are the sunflower and tobacco. Around 800 CE, Eastern Algonquins adopted maize agriculture from the neighbors in the interior. Even among groups who mainly hunted, agricultural products were an important source of food. They obtained what was needed by trading with the raiding societies that practiced more agriculture. Eastern Algonquins created pots that could withstand not only thermal stress but mechanical stress of rough use. Archaeological sites on Morrison Island near Pembroke, within the territory of the later Kichisi-Piriniwak, reveal a 1,000-year-old culture that manufactured copper tools and weapons. Copper ore was extracted north of Lake Superior and distributed down to today's northern New York. Local pottery artifacts from this period show widespread similarities that indicate the continuing use of the river for cultural exchange throughout the Canadian Shield and beyond. Some centuries later, the Algonquin tribe moved in and inhabited the islands and shores along the Ottawa. By the 17th century, the first Europeans found them well established as a hunter-gatherer society in control of the river. The Kichisi-Piriniwak showed entrepreneurial spirit. On Morrison Island, at the location where 5,000-year-old copper artifacts were discovered, the Kichisi-Pirini band levied a toll on canoe flotillas descending the river. Ethnobotany. The Algonquin of Quebec use an infusion of leaves of Epicea repens for kidney disorders. Modern events. In 1981, members of the Algonquin tribe successfully blockaded a commercial rice harvesting venture which the Government of Canada had granted permission to harvest wild rice. The tribe had traditionally gathered this grain by hand for centuries. Hundreds of people blockaded roads, and despite police helicopters, paddy wagons, and a lot of hostility and pushing and shoving, according to Harold Perry, honorary chief of the Arctic Algonquins, the tribe and its supporters held the ground for 27 days, long enough for the federal government to reverse its decision and revoke the commercial permit. In recent years, tensions with the lumber industry have flared up again among Algonquin communities in response to the practice of clear-cutting. In Ontario, an Algonquin land claim has been ongoing since 1983, encompassing much of the southeastern part of the province, stretching from near North Bay to near Hawkesbury and including Ottawa, Pembroke, and most of Algonquin Provincial Park. The Algonquins never relinquished title to this area. An agreement in principle between the Algonquins of Ontario, the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario was reached in 2015. In 2000, Algonquins from Timiskaming First Nation played a significant part in the local popular opposition to the plan to convert Adams Mine into a garbage dump. Members of the Algonquin tribe began a peaceful blockade of an operation on the sacred lands north of Kingston, Ontario on June 29, 2007. Oakville-based Frontenac Ventures Corporation, the prospecting company, sought a court order to force the protesters from the area. A court injunction was obtained on August 27, 2007, and a series of arrests followed, including that of the Arctic Algonquin First Nation co-chiefs Robert Lovelace and Paula Sherman. Chief Lovelace served a 6-month sentence for contempt of court for violating the injunction, which required all protesters to remain at least 200 meters from the mining site. Chief Sherman also received a 6-month sentence, but it was suspended as she agreed to respect the injunction. Tens of thousands of dollars in fines were levied against them. In addition to the charges of contempt, Frontenac Ventures is suing the Algonquins for $77 million in civil damages. On March 18, 2008, contempt charges were dropped without costs against 3 non-native activists, Frank Morrison, and Christian peacemakers David Milne and Reverend John Hudson. They had been charged with violating the same injunction as Lovelace and Sherman, but Frontenac Ventures declined to prosecute. During the same proceedings, however, warrants were obtained for the arrest of 5 other non-native activists who allegedly violated the injunction. Communities. At the time of the first meeting with the French in 1603, the various Algonquin bands probably had a combined population somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000. The British estimate in 1768 was 1,500. As of 2000, there are close to 8,000 Algonquins in Canada, organized into 10 separate First Nations, 9 in Quebec and 1 in Ontario. Historic Algonquin nations documented as early as 1630, Quebec, Quicheza-Pyrénées. They were the largest and most powerful group of Algonquins, known variously as Kichezi-Pyrénées, Kichezi-Pyrénées-Wok, Algonquins, Delisle-Alumets, Big River people, Gens Delisle, Honkerenon, Island Algonquin, Island Indians, Island Nation, people from the island, Kichezi-Pyrénées-Wek Nation, Delisle Nation of the Isle, and Savages Delisle. The main village was on Morrison Island. Kinincha-Pyrénées, also known as Kinush, Kinocha-Pyrénées-Wek, Kinonja-Pyrénées-Wok, Kinonsh-Pickle, Pike and Quinong of Bin. Sometimes they were listed as an Algonquin band, but after 1650 they were associated with the Ottawa and were originally found along the lower Ottawa River below Allumette Island. Otago-Tau-Emin, also known as Kotako-Utoemi or Auteo-Ukotwemiwek. They were located along the upper Ottawa River above Allumette Island. Sagagani-Wok, also known as Sagagani-Rini. Saganai-Teo-Agama, also known as Sagashaganirini-Wek. Weskarini, also known as the Wavatske-Chirini-Wok, La Petite Nation, Little Nation, Awawech-Pyrini, Uasuarini, Washerini, Wian-Ontat-Turanon, or Petite Nation. The traditional homeland is located on the north side of the Ottawa River along the Lever River and the Rouge River in Quebec. Ontario Iroquois, they were known as Iroquois, Iroquois, Iroqueto, and to the Huron as the Atonon-Trataranon or On-One-Chataranon. They lived along Ontario's South Nation River. Matawa-Kariniwak, people of the Bulrushed Shore, also known as Madawaska, Matuchkarine, Matuashita, Mataachkarini, Matuchkariniwek and Matuaskarini. The Madawask, a river in the upper Ottawa Valley, is named after this band. Nabachis, located at Muskrat Lake near present-day Cobden, Ontario. Contemporary status nations in Quebec: Kitigan-Zibi-Anishinabek, Kitigan-Zibi-Maniwaki, Timiskaming First Nation, Notre-Dame-du-Nord, Quebec. Nation Anishinaabe-du-Lac-Simon, Lac-Simon, Quebec. Abitibi-Winni First Nation, Picogan, Quebec. Eagle Village First Nation, Témiskaming, Quebec. Long Point First Nation, Winnoway River, Quebec. Algonquins of Barrier Lake, Lac Rapide. Anicinàpe Community of Kitchsakik, Val d'Or, Quebec. Wolf Lake First Nation, Témiscamingue, Quebec, formed from three historical bands: Dumwan Lake Band of Algonquin, Grassy Lake Band of Algonquin, Lac des Quins Band of Algonquin. Status nations in Ontario: Metashawan First Nation, Metashawan, Ontario, formed in part by Algonquins. Temagami First Nation, Temagami, Ontario, formed in part by Algonquins. Wagoshig First Nation, Black River Matheson, Ontario, formed in part by Algonquins. Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation, Golden Lake, Ontario. Non-status nations: Arctic Algonquin First Nation, comprising 11 smaller bands. Big Rideau Algonquin First Nation, Bobs Lake Algonquin First Nation, Caliburgi Algonquin First Nation, Eagle Lake Algonquin First Nation, Eel Lake Algonquin First Nation, Fall River Algonquin First Nation, Golden Lake Algonquin First Nation. Divided into two groups: Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation, Kijicha Manitomata, Uskarini Algonquin Nation, Bonashare Algonquin Community, Matawakan Algonquin First Nation, Ottawa Algonquin First Nation, Chabot Obrajivan First Nation, Derive Algonquin First Nation, Beaverhouse Algonquin First Nation, Kitchesaperini Algonquin First Nation, Weskarini Algonquin First Nation, Temagami Lake Band of Algonquin, Washagami Lake Band of Algonquin. These population figures are from Canada's Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. The Nipissing First Nation of North Bay, Ontario, is also sometimes considered to belong to the Algonquin group of Anishinaabe.